So we'll be discussing a study titled Effectiveness of Polypill for Primary and Secondary Prevention of Cardiovascular Diseases, the Poly-Iran study, a pragmatic cluster randomized trial that was published in The Lancet in 2019. So we're gonna take a discussion type approach for this. All right, so what population was being studied in this particular trial? Because for my reading, it's kind of interesting because it's nested within a cohort study, the Golestan cohort study. They just call it GCS. So anyone between the ages of 50 and 75. Basically any adult who met their inclusion criteria and didn't have any of the exclusion criteria who were part of this cohort were included. So we're looking at a large population in rural Iran.
Yeah, and I think the Iran part was certainly interesting to me, and particularly looking at rural villages. And it helped me, when it says they're looking at the burden of cardiovascular disease in low income to middle income countries. So right off the bat, I was kind of thinking, is this going to apply to us or not, being Canadian and being in a high income country? I thought it was interesting that, they developed this idea of a polypill 15 years ago. And I guess I hadn't heard about it because we are so tailored and using all kinds of different dosages. And they do reference the limitations of the past research and why this was so good at the fact that there's so many patients and everything, and the past has been small to moderate sample sizes.
Yeah, and when you just read the abstract, you get the impression that you've got this large cohort, and we're just going to give this polypill to everybody of a fixed age. They took everybody except and there's this huge long list of people that had previous cough, that had angioedema, that had previous bleeding or peptic ulcer disease, that had a history of stroke or pregnancy or lactation, alcohol consumption, every mental health condition known to man.
But what's interesting is that essentially this is a trial on people who are healthy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Relatively healthy now, which is interesting because the outcome is actually quite impressive when you're thinking about these are healthy people, right? I have some issues with that, but we'll get to that in a second.
So the first polypill that patients could be prescribed would include either hydrochlorothiazide 12.5 milligrams, aspirin 81, atorvastatin 20, and enalapril 5. And then anyone who developed cough from that would be switched to a polypill that had valsartan 40 milligrams instead of the enalapril 5 milligrams. So that was the specific intervention that we're looking at. In addition to, both intervention and comparison groups experienced this non-pharmacological preventive intervention.
So I guess when you look at the components of the polypill, I'm happy that these are generally healthy people, because those doses of those medications are usually not going to get them to targets if we think the way that we're trained. And I think I was concerned that these medications could of course cause undue harm, but they actually reported that there was no increase in adverse events in the group that took the medication. So you can't blame them for wanting to try, especially because they do say that the low to middle income countries have the highest cardiovascular disease. I guess their average is significantly higher than the global average, right? So we have a bigger problem, and we're probably willing to do something that we necessarily wouldn't do in our kind of Canadian mindset.
So my other question would be, yes, so low income and low middle income is, what do you think is the effect of the follow-up that they had? Is that kind of follow-up typical or possible in that population, right? Because the follow-up is going to impact their results as well, right?
And it was differential between the two groups in this instance. Not only were they not blinded, and part of the allocation wasn't concealed, but the follow-up, the polypill group had more frequent follow-up initially to catch adverse effects than did the other group. So there are definitely some discrepancies in how the two groups were treated as they went through. So what were they measuring? What's their outcome? So you're looking at a fairly common outcome, right? Major cardiovascular events. Of course, everyone kind of defines that a little bit differently depending what study you look at, but here they're looking at hospitalization for acute coronary syndrome, fatal myocardial infarction, sudden death, heart failure, coronary artery revascularization procedures, and both non-fatal. And we had a pretty broad composite outcome
Yeah, and their hazard ratio ended up being 0.66, so a 30-some odd percentage reduction
Mm-hmm.
in risk, right? Which, like I said before, impressive.
So, you know, a 2.9% absolute difference in these kind of major outcomes is huge. It's too good. Is it too good?
Yeah.
Is part of what you know, you can't help but think.
I mean, when they report the number needed to treat at 34.5, I'm like, oh my
That's
goodness,
great.
that's much better than a lot of things that we
Yeah.
do common practice.
Yeah.
There's no difference here in overall mortality,
Mhm.
yet,
Right.
but there's a difference in fatal heart disease. So something else is going on, and that is a non-significant increase in non-cardiovascular death, which is counterbalancing the benefits that we're seeing on the cardiovascular side.
Yeah.
One of the benefits they were talking about was this overall high adherence rate, the overall adherence rate of about 80%. But I got a little skeptical myself, because they chose to do a cluster randomized trial because they were worried about people sharing medication within villages, so they determined that villages would be clusters. But it struck me as interesting that they didn't take that into account at all when they were talking about the great adherence rates, even though they designed the study to overcome potential pill sharing.
They're also doing things like talking to people to say, hey, did you have a heart attack? And then after they've had this self-reported heart attack, then going through some medical records, and yeah, they've got someone kind of adjudicating that in a blinded way.
If this is a true representation of how a poly pill like this would be used in this particular type of area with their culture and their different risk levels, then it looks pretty good.
I was surprised at the impact of how good the results were when we actually looked at the LDL lowering and the blood pressure lowering.
Yes.
It was so minimal.
I would like to see this repeated because it frankly looks so good. It merits being repeated and looks so good.
Yeah.
It makes me doubt it.
Yeah.
So if I could see it repeated again, I think that would help
That would
me.
be.
Well, there are some things like it. Dr. Davis, you mentioned the problems with some of the blinding allocation stuff, and it's interesting to see that the effect size shrinks when you've blinded the allocation a little better.
Yeah, in terms of size and length of follow-up is pretty impressive for a
Yeah.
pragmatic study in a rural
Yeah.
population. Over 6,000 people for 5 years they followed these
5 years.
patients. It's pretty impressive. I do think the generalizability of this study is particularly interesting. I mean, clearly, I think we all agree this is not generalizable to our population.
Yeah.
Our population doesn't look anything like this population in terms of background medication, diet.
It's interesting too because our lifestyle factors are so different. I mean, there's no obesity in this, in the particular villages that I worked in. There was no obesity. Certainly a high salt content in the foods, but no obesity from fast foods in that sense. And certainly had hypertension, but mostly from hereditary factors. Like their lifestyle is completely different, and our same factors like no smoking over there.
So overall, a very interesting trial, potentially
Yeah.
make a significant impact on the world's overall rate of cardiovascular events, if these results really are true, which I don't think we're entirely sold on.
Yeah, so in a global perspective, looking at generalizability in a global perspective, it actually has some merit, I think.
Thank you very much,
I know.
Mr. Chong and Dr. Bugden and Dr. Balsom for joining me
That went
today.